Welcome to another calming journey through time with boring history for sleep. Tonight we'll drift into the world of one of history's most legendary figures, Alexander the Great. But don't expect a fast-paced adventure. No, tonight we'll move slowly and gently as we unravel his conquests and wars, one battle at a time. So, go ahead, settle in. Dim your lights, pull your blanket up around you, and make yourself comfortable. Let the weight of the day slowly fade away as we prepare to venture back to the ancient world. Take a deep, calming breath in. Hold it for just a moment. And as you breathe out, feel your body relax. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. Now, let's begin, as the soft, steady hum of ancient life carries us back through time to the quiet, measured steps of one of history's greatest military leaders. Imagine the distant clatter of hooves, the whisper of silk banners in the wind, and the deep, thoughtful silence of a commander in the midst of it all. Good evening, friends. Tonight, we drift quietly back in time to a place where history was just beginning to unfold, in a small kingdom called Macedon. Picture yourself in the year 356 BCE. The air is warm with the promise of summer, and the gentle sound of nature fills the space around you. In the distance, the slow rhythm of life carries on. But tonight, something special is happening. Inside the stone walls of the royal palace in Pella, the birth of a child has taken place. It's a quiet night, and the newborn child in the arms of Queen Olympias is destined to change the course of history. His name is Alexander. Though you wouldn't know it yet, this small, helpless child will one day become known as Alexander the Great. But in this moment, all is still. The palace is alive with soft murmurs, the flicker of candles, and the delicate scent of incense floating in the air. Alexander is just a baby, unaware of the massive weight of the world that will rest on his shoulders. Yet the world itself is already shifting, responding to the arrival of a new prince, a new heir to the Macedonian throne. Imagine, for a moment, what it must have been like for the king, Philip II. There was no way of knowing at that time what Alexander would become, but as the child lay in his mother's arms, a great sense of anticipation filled the room, not just for the royal family, but for an empire that would eventually stretch across continents. The story of this boy was only beginning to unfold. Alexander, in his early days, was much like any other child. His days were spent in the palace, surrounded by tutors and guards. He was growing up in a world where war was never far off, but it was a world that still felt peaceful. Quiet days were spent observing his father's soldiers, who drilled and trained in the fields. It wasn't a life of playfulness, as you might expect for most children, but one of responsibility, learning and watching. From a young age, Alexander would begin to understand the ways of leadership, and perhaps even then, he sensed that his future would not be bound by the walls of the palace. The calm of those early days must have been a contrast to the inner fire that stirred inside young Alexander. Even as a child, he exhibited a sharp mind, a keen intellect, and an ambitious spirit. While most children might have been content with their toys and games, Alexander often found himself absorbed in the thoughts of power and empire. His father, King Philip, recognized this quickly, and so, like many royal children of his time, Alexander was tutored in a way that prepared him for the challenges of leadership. It was at this time that his tutor arrived. The philosopher Aristotle, one of the greatest minds of the ancient world, became a fixture in young Alexander's life. Under Aristotle's tutelage, Alexander was taught more than just the art of leadership. He was exposed to the world of science, philosophy, and literature. It was in these quiet moments, under the shade of trees and within the walls of the palace, that the seeds of greatness began to take root. Imagine Alexander sitting in the gardens with his tutor, listening intently to lessons on the world beyond his home, lessons on the great empires of the East, the mysteries of the natural world, and the lives of legendary heroes. As young as he was, Alexander's thoughts were always turning, imagining worlds far beyond the Macedonian borders. He would often ask questions that went beyond the scope of a child's curiosity, questions about war, leadership, and what lay across the seas. In those quiet hours, as the sun filtered through the branches above, Alexander's mind began to stretch out toward horizons unknown, to lands far beyond the reaches of his small kingdom. Perhaps he didn't yet understand the full extent of his destiny, but one thing was already clear. The fire of ambition had already started to burn brightly within him. And as we leave the garden of learning behind, I invite you to drift with me as we move toward the next chapter of Alexander's life. Soon, the lessons of the mind would be tested in the battlefield, and the boy who once sat in the shade would rise to become a king. Let's continue on this journey step by step as we trace the path of Alexander the Great. As we continue our gentle journey back in time, imagine now the years that passed quietly and steadily, shaping the young Alexander into the man who would one day conquer vast lands. We leave behind the calm gardens of learning and drift forward in time to the moment when Alexander's world would shift forever. The year is now 336 BCE. A young Alexander, now just 20 years old, finds himself at the edge of a new beginning. His father, King Philip II, has spent years building a powerful kingdom, uniting the fractured city-states of Greece into a formidable force. But for all his father's victories, the mantle of leadership has always seemed to belong to Alexander, even as a child. He had watched from the sidelines, learning the intricacies of leadership, strategy, and battle. Yet the world of royalty is never as calm as it seems. Events take a tragic turn. Philip, the mighty king, is assassinated during a celebration in the city of Aegi. The blow is sudden, the grief unexpected, and there, in the shadow of his father's death, young Alexander is thrust into the role of king. Imagine the silence that must have filled the room when the news reached Alexander's ears. The weight of the crown, of responsibility, suddenly pressed down upon him. There would have been no time for hesitation, no space for doubt. He was now king of Macedon, and the kingdom that had once been his father's was now his own. Despite the shock, Alexander was not the kind of person to dwell on grief for long. Even as a young man, he had learned to control his emotions and focus his mind on the task at hand. The Macedonian army, his father's greatest legacy, was waiting. The world beyond his kingdom was watching. And soon, Alexander's first challenge as king would come. As soon as the news of Philip's assassination spread, several Greek city-states, once controlled under Philip's leadership, saw an opportunity to rebel. Athens and Thebes in particular hoped that without Philip's presence, Macedon's control over Greece might weaken. But they underestimated the resolve of the new king. With quiet determination, Alexander began to gather his forces. His response would not be swift or angry. No, Alexander had learned the art of patience, and he understood the importance of strategy. He carefully studied the cities, the people, and the land around him, preparing for the right moment to strike. His first move would come not through brute force, but through precision. After swiftly dealing with the revolts within Greece, Alexander set his eyes on something larger. He wasn't content to just rule over Macedon. He wanted to conquer the world, and his first steps would take him beyond the borders of Greece. His ambitions grew. His mind began to envision a future that stretched beyond the reach of any kingdom known to man. At 20 years old, Alexander began his first great military campaign. His goal? To continue his father's work and crush the Persian Empire, a mighty force that had stood at the heart of the ancient world for centuries. The time had come for Alexander to take the first steps of his grand journey. Imagine Alexander standing at the front of his army, a young king, barely more than a boy, yet carrying himself with the confidence of a seasoned leader. The wind would be heavy with the scent of dust and steel as soldiers readied their armor and sharpened their swords. In the distance, the banners of Macedon fluttered proudly in the wind. a symbol of the might of a kingdom just beginning to stretch its arms across the world. This would be Alexander's first test of strength, but it would not be the last. And as we leave that moment of rising tension behind, I invite you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine the stillness of the battlefield, the soft hum of the wind, the quiet anticipation in the air, and the young king poised to change the world. In the next part of Alexander's journey, his army will march forth, and his name will soon be wispy, aired across lands he's yet to conquer. The year is now 336 BCE. A young Alexander, now just 20 years old, finds himself at the edge of a new beginning. His father, King Philip II, has spent years building a powerful kingdom, uniting the fractured city-states of Greece into a formidable force. But for all his father's victories, the mantle of leadership had always seemed to belong to Alexander, even as a child. He had watched from the sidelines, learning the intricacies of leadership, strategy, and battle. Yet the world of royalty is never as calm as it seems. Events take a tragic turn. Philip, the mighty king, is assassinated during a celebration in the city of Ægæ. The blow is sudden, the grief unexpected, and there, in the shadow of his father's death, young Alexander is thrust into the role of king. The weight of the crown, of responsibility, suddenly presses down upon him. There would have been no time for hesitation, no space for doubt. He was now king of Macedon, and the kingdom that had once been his father's was now his own. Despite the shock, Alexander was not the kind of person to dwell on grief for long. Even as a young man, he had learned to control his emotions and focus his mind on the task at hand. The Macedonian army, his father's greatest legacy, was waiting. The world beyond his kingdom was watching, and soon Alexander's first challenge as king would come. As soon as the news of Philip's assassination spread, several Greek city-states, once controlled under Philip's leadership, saw an opportunity to rebel. Athens and Thebes, in particular, hoped that without Philip's presence, Macedon's control over Greece might weaken, but they underestimated the resolve of the new king. With quiet determination, Alexander began to gather his forces. His response would not be swift or angry. No, Alexander had learned the art of patience, and he understood the importance of strategy. He carefully studied the cities, the people, and the land around him, preparing for the right moment to strike. His first move would come not through brute force, but through precision. After swiftly dealing with the revolts within Greece, Alexander set his eyes on something larger. He wasn't content to just rule over Macedon. He wanted to conquer the world, and his first steps would take him beyond the borders of Greece. His ambitions grew. His mind began to envision a future that stretched beyond the reach of any kingdom known to man. At 20 years old, Alexander began his first great military campaign. His goal? To continue his father's work and crush the Persian Empire, a mighty force that had stood at the heart of the ancient world for centuries. The time had come for Alexander to take the first steps of his grand journey. Imagine Alexander standing at the front of his army, a young king, barely more than a boy, yet carrying himself with the confidence of a seasoned leader. The wind would be heavy with the scent of dust and steel as soldiers readied their armor and sharpened their swords. In the distance, the banners of Macedon fluttered proudly in the wind, a symbol of the might of a kingdom just beginning to stretch its arms across the world. This would be Alexander's first test of strength, but it would not be the last. And as we leave that moment of rising tension behind, the young king, with the weight of his empire before him, prepares to take the next step in his quest. His name would soon be whispered across lands he had yet to conquer, and the battles that lay ahead would mark the beginning of a journey that would change the world forever. With the rebellion in Greece swiftly quelled. Alexander's attention turned to the mighty Persian Empire. The Persian king, Darius III, ruled over a vast land stretching from modern-day Turkey through Iran and beyond. His empire was ancient and powerful, but it was also sprawling and disjointed, with many different regions and peoples, each with their own challenges. For Alexander, this was not just a battle for conquest, it was a battle to prove his greatness. His father, King Philip II, had laid the groundwork for Macedon's rise to power, but now it was up to Alexander to push beyond those borders. Alexander's ambition was not just to win battles, it was to establish an empire greater than any that had come before. His mind, already shaped by the teachings of Aristotle, was constantly strategizing and envisioning the world he could create. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander set out with his army, crossing into Asia Minor. His first major test would come at the Battle of Granicus. This was a critical moment, not only because it was his first major confrontation with the Persian forces, but also because it would set the tone for the rest of his campaign. The battlefield was uneven, with the river Granicus cutting through the land like a dividing line. On one side stood Alexander and his army, on the other, a Persian force far larger in number. The Persians, confident in their superior numbers, believed the Macedonian forces would hesitate or retreat. But Alexander, calm and unwavering, saw this as an opportunity. As the battle unfolded, Alexander led his forces straight into the heart of the Persian lines, defying traditional military tactics. With his brilliant strategy, he overwhelmed the Persian cavalry, breaking their ranks and driving them back. It was a resounding victory, and it sent a clear message not just to Darius, but to the rest of the world. Alexander was not to be underestimated. The Battle of Granicus was just the beginning. Alexander knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with more challenges. Yet, with each victory, his reputation grew, and the stories of his courage and brilliance spread far and wide. He was no longer just the young prince of Macedon. He was becoming a force to be reckoned with, a leader whose ambition and determination would drive him forward, no matter the cost. Now, let your thoughts drift for a moment as we leave the battlefield behind. The road ahead is filled with even greater challenges, and Alexander's journey is far from over. The next chapter of his story will bring him to even more legendary battles, where the true scale of his vision will unfold. After the victory at Granicus, Alexander continued his march through Asia Minor, pushing forward with relentless determination. His next target was the city of Sardis, a wealthy Persian stronghold. Sardis, perched high on a hill, was considered nearly invulnerable, yet Alexander's mind worked in ways that few could understand. Instead of laying siege and waiting for months, he moved quickly, using his speed and the element of surprise to his advantage. In a single, swift attack, Alexander's forces captured the city, sending shockwaves through the Persian Empire. The success at Sardis reinforced his reputation as a leader who was not bound by conventional tactics. His ability to strike decisively and unexpectedly made him a formidable foe. It wasn't just about the battles he won, but the way in which he won them, with strategy, speed, and an unshakable confidence that infected his entire army. The victories continued, and soon Alexander found himself moving deeper into Persian territory. His path led him to the city of Issus, a place where another great battle would unfold. But this time, the stakes were even higher. Darius III had gathered a massive force, far larger than Alexander's own, to face him. This battle, the Battle of Issus, would be pivotal in determining the future of the campaign. Alexander's army, though outnumbered, was a finely tuned machine. Every soldier knew their role, and every move was calculated with precision. As the battle began, it was clear that the terrain would play a critical role. The narrow passes near the Mediterranean Sea gave Alexander the advantage he needed. He used the natural landscape to limit the Persian army's ability to maneuver, while his forces remained agile and ready to strike. As the battle raged, Alexander, ever the leader, pressed forward. He saw his moment and charged directly at the Persian heart, where Darius stood, attempting to rally his forces. It was a risky move, but Alexander's instinct for leadership was unmatched. His cavalry broke through the Persian lines, scattering the enemy forces, and in that moment, Darius himself fled the battlefield, leaving his troops in disarray. The victory at Issus was decisive. It cemented Alexander's position as a true conqueror, but it also marked the beginning of something much larger, an empire that would stretch from Greece to India, with Alexander at its helm. Yet even as he basked in the glory of this victory, Alexander's ambition had not dulled. He knew that the Persian Empire was vast, and Darius, though defeated, was still a force to be reckoned with. As Alexander's army moved forward, he made a point to show respect to the cities and their people. In some places, he was welcomed as a liberator, freeing them from Persian control. In others, he faced resistance. But with each victory, his legend grew, and the desire to join his cause spread like wildfire across the lands he passed. People saw in him not just a conqueror, but a man with a vision of a unified world under one banner. As the dust of Issus settles, the path ahead remains long and full of challenges. But Alexander's resolve remains as strong as ever, and the world watches closely as his empire grows. The next steps will take him into even more unfamiliar lands, where the true test of his leadership will unfold. With his victory at Issus, Alexander had struck a heavy blow to the Persian Empire, but his journey was far from over. The throne of Persia still belonged to Darius III, and the road ahead promised even greater challenges. The path of conquest had already begun, and as Alexander moved deeper into the heart of Persia, he knew that each new battle would require not just strength, but also wisdom and patience. The next landmark on his journey was the great city of Tyre, an island city that had resisted any form of invasion for centuries. Tyre, located on the eastern Mediterranean coast, was a powerful and wealthy city, surrounded by thick, impregnable walls that stretched all the way to the sea. Alexander, never one to shy away from the impossible, knew this would be one of his greatest tests. Rather than retreating in the face of Tyre's formidable defenses, Alexander's mind set to work. He began to gather resources for a daring plan. To defeat Tyre, he would need to make an unprecedented move. His solution? Build a causeway, a massive bridge, from the mainland to the island city. The task was enormous, but Alexander's army worked tirelessly, hauling stones and rubble day and night to create a pathway into the city. As the causeway slowly took shape, the people of Tyre watched with disbelief. The walls of the city had long been considered insurmountable, and yet, here was Alexander, determined to turn the tide of the siege. His forces worked relentlessly, and in time, the causeway was complete. Once again, Alexander's vision had exceeded the boundaries of traditional warfare. The great walls of Tyre, once thought impregnable, would soon be breached. With the causeway in place, Alexander's forces launched their final assault on the city. The battle was fierce, and the Tyrians fought with desperation, knowing the fate of their city hung in the balance. But Alexander's strategy and determination proved unbreakable. After months of preparation, Tyre fell. The city was captured, and Alexander's triumph was complete. His reputation as a military genius spread even further, and his legend grew with each passing day. Yet Alexander's conquest of Tyre was not without its darker moments. After the city's capture, thousands of Tyrians were killed or enslaved. A stark reminder that Alexander's empire was built not only through brilliance, but also through force. Despite this, the conquest marked a turning point in Alexander's campaign, and the way was now clear for him to move deeper into the Persian heartlands. As Alexander continued eastward, his empire expanded rapidly. His army crossed vast deserts and marched through lands that had once seemed as distant as the stars. Yet with every victory, the demands on his leadership grew. He began to encounter not just military resistance, but questions from his own men. Alexander, despite his seemingly boundless ambition, was not immune to the challenges of empire building. His army, weary from years of relentless campaigning, began to voice their concerns. They had marched through countless lands, faced endless battles, and conquered cities one after another. Now, as they reached the edges of the Persian Empire, they longed to return home to the lands they had once known. But Alexander, steadfast in his belief that he was destined for something greater, refused to turn back. He had already conquered the known world, but he saw the vast expanse of India waiting just beyond the horizon. The question now was, would his army follow him, or would they choose to stop here, at the very edge of the world they had known? As Alexander stands at the crossroads of history, we leave him, not yet knowing the ultimate fate of his great empire. His next move would push him further than anyone could have predicted, taking him to the farthest reaches of the known world. The story of his conquests, now on the brink of new territory, was far from finished. After the conquest of Tyre, Alexander's empire stretched across vast and varied lands, but his ambition was far from quenched. He had already toppled the great Persian Empire and claimed cities like Tyre, Egypt, and Syria, yet his gaze always remained fixed on the horizon. To him, the world was still incomplete, waiting to be shaped by his hand. As the year 332 BCE began to unfold, Alexander moved into Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs, where the people, weary of Persian rule, eagerly welcomed the young conqueror as a liberator. Here, in the cradle of civilization, Alexander would leave an indelible mark, not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler who embraced the cultures he encountered. In Egypt, he was crowned pharaoh, a title that cemented his role as not just a military leader, but a divine figure in the eyes of the Egyptians. But it was not just Egypt's cities and monuments that fascinated Alexander. It was the ancient wisdom, the philosophies, and the mysteries of this land that called to him. As he walked through the grand temples of Thebes and visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa, he came to see himself not just as a ruler, but as part of a much larger legacy, a legacy that connected him to the gods themselves. As Alexander stood before the oracle, he sought answers that would propel him further into the unknown. It was here that the oracle declared Alexander to be the son of Amun, linking him to the divine and reassuring him that his path was guided by forces greater than mere mortal hands. With this divine confirmation, Alexander's conviction grew stronger. He was no longer just a conqueror, he was a force of destiny. The gods themselves had anointed him. And so, with his place in Egypt secure, Alexander continued his journey. But he was not content to rest in the warmth of Egyptian hospitality for long. He had conquered the known world, yet there was still more to claim, more to achieve, more to prove. To the east, beyond the familiar reaches of Persia, lay India, vast, untamed, and brimming with new challenges. The journey would take him through the unforgiving deserts and hostile mountains of Persia, into lands where the idea of empire was still a distant dream. But for Alexander, the world was always waiting for him to leave his mark, to stretch the boundaries of his empire farther than anyone could imagine. And so, with his army at his side, he set his sights on the east once more, to the land of the Gordian Knot and beyond. As we leave Egypt behind, the road ahead promises more battles, more cities, and more challenges. Alexander, having claimed Egypt and embraced the divine, now looks further east, where the next stage of his journey awaits. A place where the myths and legends of the East will intersect with the reality of conquest. After Alexander's divine anointment in Egypt, the path forward seemed set before him. His ambition had already led him from Greece to Persia, from Egypt to Tyre, and now the Eastern world lay at his feet. He had taken everything in his stride, but the true test of his might was yet to come. Beyond Persia, beyond the lands he had already conquered, lay India, a place of mystery, wealth, and great peril. In the spring of 326 BCE, Alexander and his army, weary yet resolute, crossed the Hindu Kush mountains into the unknown. The air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar trees and strange spices, the winds carrying the whispers of faraway lands. The army had marched across thousands of miles, faced countless battles, and yet here they were, on the edge of a world few had dared to enter. The first challenge they faced was the mighty river Indus, a vast and powerful body of water that separated Alexander from his ultimate goal. But Alexander, never one to shy away from challenges, saw only an obstacle to be overcome. Using the full strength of his army, he had boats built to cross the river. The sight of his men rowing tirelessly across the current must have been a sight of determination, a symbol of the army's unwavering resolve to continue forward, no matter the cost. Once across, Alexander was greeted by a new and unexpected challenge: the fierce resistance of the Indian kingdoms. The people of the region, led by local rulers, did not know the Macedonian king, and they certainly did not fear him in the way the Greeks and Persians had. The lands of India were vast, and their warriors, armed with elephants and sophisticated battle strategies, presented an entirely new kind of threat. The first major battle in India took place at the Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus of the Paurava kingdom. The terrain was unfamiliar, the landscape lush and dotted with rivers, yet Alexander's tactical genius would once again prove unstoppable. Porus's army, though large and formidable, was no match for Alexander's well-trained and disciplined forces. But the real challenge came not from Porus's infantry, but from his war elephants, massive, imposing creatures, armored and trained for battle. The sight of these elephants charging toward the Macedonian lines must have been a terrifying one. Yet Alexander's soldiers, hardened by years of battle, held firm. In the midst of the battle, Alexander's troops used their mobility and superior strategy to break the formation of Porus's army, cutting off their supplies and isolating them from their reinforcements. The battle was a resounding success for Alexander, but it came at a high cost. The casualties on both sides were heavy, and even Alexander's army, accustomed to victory, was shaken by the sheer scale of the fight. As Alexander approached the defeated King Porus, a moment of diplomacy followed the brutality of war. To the surprise of many, Alexander treated Porus with respect, even offering him his kingdom back and making him an ally. The great conqueror, though fierce in battle, knew the importance of alliances, and this act of mercy secured the loyalty of the Indian king, adding another valuable ally to his growing empire. Yet, despite this victory, Alexander's army had reached a breaking point. For years, they had marched through endless deserts, fought in scorching heat, and endured hardships that few could comprehend. Now, on the banks of the river Indus, they stood at the edge of the world. Alexander, the man who had never known defeat, found himself facing not just foreign kings, but his own men's exhaustion. They had been at war for nearly a decade, and their desire to continue this endless campaign began to wane. At this moment, as Alexander considered further conquests in India, his army, fatigued, longing for home, refused to march on. They had seen the endless stretches of land and could not bear the thought of pushing further into the unknown. The soldiers who had followed Alexander across Greece, through Persia, and into Egypt now felt the weight of the world on their shoulders. For the first time, Alexander faced the true limits of his ambition. Reluctantly, he agreed to turn back, leading his army southward, retracing their steps toward Babylon. His dreams of conquering all of India would have to wait, but the legacy of his campaigns would live on in every corner of the empire he had built. As we leave the banks of the river Indus behind, imagine the silent resolve in Alexander's heart as he began the journey back. Though his men had turned away from the vastness of India, Alexander's vision had already altered the course of history. His empire may have reached its limits for now, but the echoes of his triumphs and his ambition would continue to resonate for centuries. The journey back from India was not an easy one. Alexander's army, now weary from years of constant marching, fighting, and hardship, had a long road ahead. Though the soldiers had reluctantly agreed to turn back, the decision was not without its toll. The great conqueror, who had led them through countless battles and across vast distances, now found himself facing his own army's exhaustion. As they retraced their steps through the harsh terrain of Persia, Alexander's mind was heavy with the knowledge that his vision for a world united under one banner had been momentarily halted. But even as his soldiers marched home, Alexander's determination never wavered. He knew that the empire he had built was immense, stretching from Greece to Egypt, through Persia, and into the very heart of India, and that his legacy had already been secured. During their journey back, Alexander's army made a stop at the ancient city of Babylon, which would become the center of his empire. The city, once a thriving metropolis of the ancient world, was now a place where Alexander would lay the foundations for his grand vision of a unified empire. Here, Alexander sought to blend the cultures of East and West, encouraging the assimilation of Persian and Greek traditions. It was in Babylon that he began to make plans for the future, envisioning a world where the cultural divisions between the East and West could be bridged. As Alexander looked out over the city of Babylon, he saw a place where East and West could meet, where trade, ideas, and philosophies could flow freely between the two. He began to implement reforms, making Babylon the capital of his empire. New cities were built, and the infrastructure of the empire was strengthened. It was here, in Babylon, that Alexander's vision of an interconnected world began to take shape. But even in the midst of this grand vision, Alexander's health began to deteriorate. After years of constant campaigning, his body had been worn down by the stress and strain of battle, and the toll of his ambitious journey had begun to manifest. In the midst of planning his next campaign, Alexander fell ill. Some believed it was a fever, others speculated it was the result of a poison, perhaps even the result of his heavy drinking. Whatever the cause, the young conqueror, who had once been invincible in battle, now found himself vulnerable. Alexander's illness spread quickly, and soon it became clear that his time was limited. His men, who had seen him lead with unmatched strength, now watched helplessly as their king's body began to fail him. For days, Alexander lay in his palace, his fever rising and falling as his men waited, unsure of what would happen next. As he lay on his deathbed, Alexander was surrounded by his closest companions and generals. They had followed him across the known world, through countless victories and hardships, and now they stood at the threshold of his final moments. In his weakened state, Alexander was said to have been asked who would succeed him. His response, the strongest, left his empire without a plea, our heir, setting the stage for a period of division and conflict after his death. But even as Alexander's life came to an end, his legacy lived on. The empire he had built, though soon to be fractured by internal strife, would continue to shape the world for centuries to come. His conquests had spread Greek culture across the known world, creating a legacy of Hellenistic influence that would last long after his death. As we leave the city of Babylon behind, we reflect on the life of a man whose ambition knew no bounds. Though his empire would not survive in its original form, Alexander's vision for a unified world left a lasting impact. The cities he founded, the cultures he blended, and the ideals he spread would continue to resonate for generations. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, the empire he had so carefully built began to unravel. The great leader, who had stretched the boundaries of the known world, left behind a fragmented kingdom. Without a clear successor, his vast empire, which spanned from Greece to the banks of the Indus River, fractured into competing factions. The dream of a unified world under Alexander's rule was left in the hands of his generals, known as the Diadochi, who fought fiercely to carve up the empire among themselves. Despite the chaos that followed, Alexander's legacy endured. The cities he founded, Alexandria in Egypt, for example, became thriving centers of learning, culture, and trade. These cities embodied the ideals that Alexander had sought to spread across his empire: the blending of East and West, the fusion of Greek and local traditions, and the promotion of knowledge and philosophy. The cultural influence of Alexander's conquests spread far beyond the borders of his empire. The Hellenistic world, with its Greek culture and ideas, reached into the farthest corners of the East, influencing everything from art to architecture to science. Philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists traveled across the empire, exchanging ideas that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. Yet, despite the cultural flourishing that Alexander's empire had ignited, the political reality was far less stable. The Diadochi, the generals who had once been loyal to Alexander, now waged wars against each other for control. The empire was divided into separate kingdoms, each ruled by one of Alexander's former commanders. These kingdoms, such as the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia, would go on to fight for supremacy, but none would ever be as unified or powerful as the empire that Alexander had once ruled. As time passed, the memory of Alexander's greatness began to take on a mythic quality. In the centuries that followed, historians and poets would recount the tales of his conquests, his victories, and his ambition. To many, Alexander became a symbol of power, courage, and divine favor. The stories of his life were passed down, and his legend grew with each retelling. His name became synonymous with greatness, and in the eyes of the ancient world, he was the ideal ruler, one who had changed the course of history through sheer force of will. But even as his legacy lived on, the reality of Alexander's empire continued to be shaped by the struggles of his successors. The cities he founded flourished, but the unity he had sought was lost in the constant power struggles of his former generals. The empire, which had been a beacon of possibility, became a patchwork of competing states, each with its own rulers and ambitions. As we leave the fractured remnants of Alexander's empire, we reflect on the impact he had on the world. Though his empire did not survive intact, the influence of his conquests and his vision for a unified world continued to shape the course of history. Alexander's legacy would live on through the cultures he had tucked, the cities he had founded, and the ideas he had spread. As the years passed, Alexander's empire, though divided among his generals, left an indelible mark on the ancient world. His vision of a world united under a single ruler, blending East and West, Greek and local traditions, may have unraveled in the aftermath of his death, but his influence continued to echo through the centuries. One of the most significant legacies of Alexander's conquests was the spread of Hellenistic culture across the known world. The cities he founded, from Alexandria in Egypt to cities in modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, became cultural melting pots where Greek ideas, art, and philosophy intermingled with the traditions of the East. These cities became centers of learning, attracting philosophers, scientists, and scholars from all over the Mediterranean and Asia. In Alexandria, the greatest of these cities, the famed Library of Alexandria was established, becoming one of the largest and most significant libraries of the ancient world. It housed countless scrolls, texts, and manuscripts from Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and historians, as well as from the great minds of the East. Scholars from different cultures gathered here, exchanging ideas and knowledge that would shape the future of science, mathematics, and philosophy. Despite the political fragmentation of Alexander's empire, the cultural fusion he had initiated remained strong. Greek became the lingua franca of much of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, a common language that allowed for trade, communication, and the sharing of ideas. This blending of cultures laid the groundwork for the spread of Christianity in the centuries to come and played a crucial role in shaping the world as we know it today. But Alexander's legacy was not just cultural. His military tactics and strategies continued to be studied by military leaders and scholars throughout history. His ability to adapt to different terrains, his innovative use of cavalry, and his ability to inspire and lead his troops made him one of the greatest military commanders of all time. His campaigns, though brutal and marked by countless battles, became models of military genius studied by generals and strategists for centuries. However, despite his military brilliance and the cultural impact of his conquests, Alexander's empire began to crumble after his death. The Diadochi, his generals and former allies, fought amongst themselves for control of the vast territories he had conquered. Over time, the unity that Alexander had worked so hard to create dissolved into a series of warring states. The Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia were among the largest remnants of his empire, but none were able to hold the entire territory for long. Yet despite the political fragmentation, the world Alexander had touched continued to thrive in many ways. The Hellenistic period that followed his death saw the flourishing of art, science, and philosophy across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Cities like Alexandria and Antioch became thriving centers of culture, where Greek influence mingled with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions. These cities became the heart of a new world order, one in which ideas, trade, and culture flowed freely across the ancient world. As we leave the echoes of Alexander's world behind, we reflect on the lasting impact of his vision. Though his empire did not endure as he had hoped, his cultural and intellectual legacy continued to shape the course of history. His name became synonymous with greatness, and his story, a story of ambition, conquest, and vision, remained one of the most powerful narratives ever told. Though Alexander's empire was ultimately fragmented after his death, the legacy he left behind was far from ephemeral. His vision of a unified world where cultures could merge and thrive under a shared banner continued to shape the world for centuries. Even in the face of political division and military conflict, his influence lingered, quietly, deeply embedded in the fabric of history. After Alexander's death, the vast empire he had carved out with his own hand fractured into smaller kingdoms, each ruled by one of his former generals, the Diadochi. These divisions led to years of wars as the generals fought for dominance, each claiming their share of the land that Alexander had once ruled. Yet despite the division, one thing remained clear: the world had changed irrevocably. As the Diadochi waged their wars, the cities Alexander had founded, Alexandria, Antioch, and others, flourished as centers of culture and learning. The Hellenistic period, which followed Alexander's conquests, saw the continued spread of Greek ideas, arts, and philosophy across vast regions. The mingling of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures led to the creation of a new, rich cultural tapestry that influenced everything from architecture to religion, science, and politics. One of the most enduring symbols of Alexander's legacy was the city of Alexandria in Egypt. Founded by Alexander himself, it became a beacon of knowledge and culture, drawing scholars and intellectuals from all over the known world. The Library of Alexandria, one of the largest and most famous libraries in history, became a hub of learning, where scholars translated works from many cultures and contributed to the advancement of science, mathematics, and philosophy. In this new world, Greek became the lingua franca, the common language for communication and trade across the vast expanse of Alexander's former empire. It allowed for the exchange of ideas between East and West, bridging the gap between cultures that had once been isolated from one another. This cultural exchange laid the groundwork for later developments in Western and Eastern civilizations, from the spread of Christianity to the eventual blending of Islamic and European learning. Yet, despite these cultural triumphs, the political reality was far less stable. The Hellenistic kingdoms, though culturally rich, were often embroiled in conflict. The Seleucid Empire, Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia each struggled for power and territory, and the dreams of a unified empire under a single ruler faded into the distant past. Alexander's successors were unable to recreate the harmony that Alexander had hoped for, and the vision of a single, cohesive empire began to slip away. However, the idea of Alexander and his empire lived on in the stories and legends that were passed down through the generations. The narrative of his life, his conquests, and his ambition became mythic in nature. To future generations, Alexander represented the ideal ruler, one who combined military genius with philosophical vision, who sought not just to conquer, but to unite the world through culture and knowledge. As we reflect on the continued influence of Alexander's empire, we can see how the blending of East and West during the Hellenistic period continued to shape the ancient world. The cultures that Alexander brought together would go on to influence the course of history, from the rise of the Roman Empire to the development of Eastern philosophies and religions. Even as the political structures of Alexander's empire began to crumble, the cultural impact of his conquests continued to resonate through the centuries. The Hellenistic period, which emerged in the wake of his death, marked an era of profound transformation. Here, the fusion of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures led to the creation of a new, interconnected world. One of the most enduring aspects of Alexander's legacy was the spread of Greek philosophy and science throughout the East. Think of the great intellectual centers that sprouted from the cities Alexander founded, places like Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia, where scholars from every corner of his empire came together to share their knowledge. The blending of Eastern and Western thought gave rise to new schools of philosophy and scientific thought that would influence generations to come. In Alexandria, the city he had founded, the Library of Alexandria became the focal point of this intellectual revolution. With its vast collection of scrolls and manuscripts, it became the largest and most significant repository of knowledge in the ancient world. Scholars from every culture gathered there to study, translate, and expand upon the ideas of the great minds who came before them. Works of literature, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were exchanged and enhanced, paving the way for future advancements that would change the course of human history. One such scholar was Euclid, the father of geometry, whose works would lay the foundation for mathematical thought for centuries. Another was Archimedes, whose revolutionary discoveries in physics, engineering, and mathematics would shape the world for generations. These scholars, among many others, carried the torch of knowledge across the ancient world, ensuring that Alexander's vision of a unified, intellectual empire would continue long after his death. Yet, while intellectual and cultural life flourished in the cities Alexander had founded, his empire's political structure remained unstable. The Diadochi, his former generals, were locked in constant battles for control of the fragmented empire, and none of them could match Alexander's genius in uniting such vast and diverse lands. The Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia each sought to claim the legacy of Alexander, but none could hold on to his empire for long. Despite this, the cultural exchange that Alexander had set into motion continued to evolve. The fusion of Greek and Eastern traditions gave rise to new forms of art, architecture, and religion. In the realm of art, the Hellenistic style began to emerge, characterized by realistic depictions of the human form and intense emotional expression. Sculptures of gods, warriors, and philosophers began to reflect a more personal human perspective, marking a departure from the idealized forms of earlier Greek art. In the realm of religion, the syncretism that Alexander had promoted during his reign took root. The blending of Greek gods with those of Persia, Egypt, and India led to the creation of new religious practices and beliefs. The cult of Serapis, a syncretic god created by the Ptolemies in Egypt, was one example of how Greek and Egyptian religious traditions were fused together. Similarly, the spread of Greek philosophy, especially the Stoic and Epicurean schools, found fertile ground in the East, influencing the development of later philosophical and religious traditions in India and beyond. But even as the cultural legacy of Alexander's empire endured, the political fragmentation that followed his death left a lasting mark on the ancient world. The great empire that he had built, unified under his brilliant leadership, had been divided among his generals, and the dreams of a single, cohesive empire were never fully realized. Still, the idea of Alexander and his conquests lived on, inspiring future generations of rulers, thinkers, and artists. As we reflect on the continued evolution of Alexander's legacy, we see that while the political unity he sought may have been fleeting, his cultural and intellectual influence remained profound. The blending of East and West, the spread of knowledge, and the synthesis of religions and philosophies would continue to shape the world long after the fall of his empire. Even as Alexander's empire fragmented and his political vision faded into the past, his impact on the world continued to reverberate through history. His ambition, military genius, and the cultural fusion he initiated would set the stage for the world that followed, influencing not just the ancient world but shaping the future of the Western and Eastern civilizations in profound ways. The influence of Hellenistic culture would endure far beyond the end of the Diadochi Wars. In many ways, Alexander's empire, despite its fragmentation, had changed the very course of history. Greek influence spread throughout the lands he had conquered, infusing local cultures with new ideas about governance, art, philosophy, and science. And while the political unity Alexander envisioned was never achieved after his death, the spread of Greek culture remained one of the most lasting results of his conquests. In the centuries following Alexander's death, Greek cities and Greek-speaking regions continued to thrive, and new Hellenistic kingdoms arose from the ashes of the empire. These kingdoms, such as the Seleucid Empire in Asia and the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, held on to many of the traditions and ideals Alexander had instilled in his empire. But these kingdoms were also shaped by local traditions and rulers, blending East and West in a complex tapestry that influenced everything from governance to religion. The spread of Greek philosophy, which had been central to Alexander's education and vision, played a major role in this cultural exchange. Greek philosophical schools, such as Stoicism and Epicureanism, spread across the Hellenistic world and had a lasting impact on Eastern thought. These ideas, along with the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and other Greek philosophers, would eventually influence the rise of Roman thought and the development of Christian theology. The exchange of ideas between East and West, which Alexander had initiated, would ultimately lead to the birth of new intellectual traditions that shaped the medieval world. Even the arts, which flourished under the Hellenistic influence, would leave an enduring mark. The Hellenistic style of sculpture, with its focus on emotional expression and realistic portrayals of the human body, would influence Roman art for centuries. This shift from the idealized forms of classical Greek art to more naturalistic representations reflected the changing nature of the world, the personal, the emotional, the human. These became central themes in art and culture, and they continue to resonate in Western culture to this day. But perhaps one of the most important aspects of Alexander's legacy was his role in shaping the vision of empire. His conquests demonstrated the potential for vast multicultural empires, something that would later be seen in the Roman Empire and other subsequent global powers. The idea of a ruler not just conquering but uniting different peoples under one banner was a vision that would inspire future leaders throughout history, from Roman emperors to Napoleon Bonaparte. The idea of spreading culture, knowledge, and governance across vast regions became a cornerstone of empire building. Alexander's influence didn't stop with his immediate successors. The Roman Empire, which would eventually rise to dominate the Western world, was heavily influenced by the legacy of Alexander. Roman generals and leaders studied Alexander's tactics and strategies, and they admired his ability to integrate different cultures and peoples into a single empire. The Roman Empire, like Alexander's, would span continents, reaching across Europe, Africa, and Asia, and its cultural legacy would last for centuries. But even beyond the Romans, Alexander's impact would be felt in the East as well. His conquests and the subsequent spread of Greek culture would lay the groundwork for the rise of the Byzantine Empire, a continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, which would preserve and build upon Greek learning and culture. The Byzantine Empire, in turn, would play a crucial role in the preservation of classical knowledge during the medieval period, ensuring that the intellectual legacy of Alexander would survive even in the face of political decline. As we reflect on the enduring influence of Alexander's legacy, we see that his vision for a united world, though short-lived in his lifetime, had a lasting impact on civilizations for centuries to come. His cultural and intellectual contributions helped shape the world, blending East and West in ways that would continue to influence the course of history long after his death. As time passed, the world that Alexander had shaped began to evolve in ways he could never have imagined. His empire, though divided and fractured after his death, left behind a lasting cultural and intellectual legacy that endured through the ages. Though Alexander's vision for a unified world was never fully realized, the seeds he planted in the ancient world took root, influencing countless civilizations for centuries to come. One of the most remarkable aspects of Alexander's legacy was his ability to inspire future leaders and conquerors. His military genius, his strategic brilliance, and his unwavering ambition set a precedent that would be followed by many. Throughout history, military leaders have looked to Alexander for guidance on how to achieve victory, not just through sheer force, but through innovation, speed, and adaptability. Take, for example, the Roman Empire. Rome, which would eventually become one of the largest and most powerful empires in history, was deeply influenced by Alexander's conquests. Roman generals and emperors admired Alexander's ability to unite a vast and diverse empire under one banner. They studied his tactics and applied many of his strategies to their own military campaigns. The Romans, like the Macedonians, understood that to rule such an expansive empire, one had to be able to think both tactically and strategically, constantly adapting to new situations and challenges. But it wasn't just the military world that felt Alexander's influence. His cultural impact continued to be felt throughout the centuries as well. The cities he founded, especially Alexandria, became hubs of intellectual exchange, where scholars, scientists, and philosophers from all over the world came together to share knowledge. Alexandria, in particular, became a beacon of learning and innovation, housing the famous Library of Alexandria, which preserved and expanded upon the intellectual achievements of the ancient world. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's death was marked by a remarkable blending of cultures. Greek ideas and traditions merged with those of Persia, Egypt, and India, creating a unique cultural landscape that shaped the ancient world. This blending of cultures continued to influence the development of Western and Eastern civilizations. The spread of Greek philosophy, in particular, had a lasting impact on the development of Christian thought, the rise of Islam, and the intellectual movements of the Renaissance. Even in the East, Alexander's impact was felt. The rise of the Maurya Empire in India, for example, was in part a response to Alexander's campaigns in the region. Alexander's brief foray into India had sparked a wave of political and cultural change, and his conquests were seen as both a challenge and an inspiration to local rulers. Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Maurya Empire, capitalized on the political vacuum left by Alexander's withdrawal, establishing one of the largest and most powerful empires in Indian history. In many ways, Alexander's legacy was not just the empire he built, but the cultural and intellectual exchange he fostered. His conquests brought together people from different regions, cultures, and backgrounds, and his vision of a world where East and West could coexist and share knowledge became a guiding principle for future generations. The blending of cultures, the exchange of ideas, and the spread of knowledge that Alexander initiated laid the groundwork for the intellectual and cultural movements that would shape the future of the world. As we reflect on the lasting impact of Alexander's empire, we see that his vision of unity and cultural exchange, though short-lived in his lifetime, continued to shape the course of history long after his death. The world he touched, from Greece to India, was forever transformed by his conquests and the legacy he left behind. As the centuries passed, the influence of Alexander's empire continued to evolve and adapt, reaching beyond the ancient world and leaving its mark on the unfolding course of history. Though his empire itself did not survive, the cultural exchange he had set into motion laid the foundations for the rise of new civilizations and ideologies that would shape the future. One of the most profound aspects of Alexander's legacy was the continued spread of Hellenistic culture. The Greeks, through Alexander's conquests, had brought their language, philosophy, and art to regions far beyond the Mediterranean. In the centuries following Alexander's death, Greek ideas and practices began to blend with those of the East, resulting in the formation of new cultural and intellectual traditions. This fusion was particularly evident in the rise of the Byzantine Empire, which arose from the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantines, who continued many of the traditions of the Roman Empire, also preserved much of the Greek intellectual heritage that Alexander had helped spread. Byzantine scholars preserved and built upon the works of Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists, ensuring that the legacy of Alexander's empire would not be forgotten. In the West, the rise of the Roman Empire, which had been deeply influenced by Greek thought and culture, was another direct result of Alexander's campaigns. The Romans admired Alexander not only for his military achievements, but also for his ability to blend diverse cultures and traditions. As the Roman Empire expanded across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, it continued the process of cultural exchange that Alexander had started, incorporating Greek ideas and practices into Roman life. Even the spread of Christianity, which would eventually become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire, was influenced by the Hellenistic world that Alexander had helped create. The early Christian missionaries, including St. Paul, traveled widely throughout the Roman Empire, spreading the message of Christianity in regions that had once been part of Alexander's empire. Greek was the language of the early Christian scriptures, and many early Christian thinkers were deeply influenced by Greek philosophy. The teachings of Plato, Aristotle, and other Greek philosophers shaped the development of Christian theology and doctrine. Further east, the influence of Alexander's campaigns could be seen in the development of the Islamic world. The Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries, which saw the spread of Islam across the Middle East and beyond, were built upon a foundation of cultural exchange that Alexander had helped establish. The Islamic world inherited much of the intellectual heritage of the Greeks, particularly in the fields of science, mathematics, and philosophy. Islamic scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon the knowledge that had been passed down through Alexander's empire. In many ways, the intellectual achievements of the Islamic Golden Age were a continuation of the cultural exchange that Alexander had initiated centuries earlier. Even as his empire crumbled and his dream of a unified world fell apart, Alexander's impact on the world remained indelible. His campaigns and the cities he founded ensured that the cultural and intellectual legacy of the ancient world would not be lost. The fusion of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian cultures continued to influence the development of civilizations for centuries, shaping the world in ways that Alexander could never have predicted. As we conclude this journey through the enduring legacy of Alexander, we see that his impact was far greater than just the empire he built. His conquests, his vision, and his unrelenting ambition changed the world, laying the groundwork for future generations to build upon. His name, and the world he helped create, continues to echo through the halls of history. The life of Alexander the Great was one of extraordinary ambition, military genius, and cultural impact, but it was also steeped in myth. From the moment of his birth, Alexander was surrounded by omens, prophecies, and legends that elevated him beyond the mortal realm. Over time, these stories merged with his historical achievements, transforming Alexander into a figure of mythic proportions, a conqueror whose very name became synonymous with destiny and divine favor. In ancient cultures, great leaders were often imbued with supernatural qualities, and Alexander was no exception. The tales of his life, his feats of strength and strategy, and his incredible victories were woven into the fabric of myth, creating a narrative that blurred the line between history, and legend. In the centuries following his death, stories began to circulate that portrayed Alexander not just as a man, but as a hero of divine lineage, sent to reshape the world. One of the most enduring aspects of Alexander's myth was his supposed divine heritage. According to ancient sources, Alexander was the son of King Philip II of Macedon and Queen Olympias. But his connection to the gods was often emphasized in the stories told about him. It was said that during his conception, Olympias had been visited by a serpent, an animal often associated with the god Zeus. In some versions of the tale, the serpent was a manifestation of Zeus himself, suggesting that Alexander was not just the son of a mortal king, but the son of the king of the gods. The belief in Alexander's divine parentage was further reinforced during his lifetime. As he traveled through Egypt, Alexander visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where he was proclaimed the son of Amun, an identification that aligned him with the divine. This moment marked a turning point in his reign, as it confirmed his status as a ruler not only chosen by the gods, but also as a godlike figure himself. From that point on, Alexander began to incorporate elements of divine kingship into his persona, accepting worship from his soldiers and from the peoples he conquered as a god-king. This mythic status was not just a personal matter for Alexander. It had deep political implications as well. By presenting himself as a divine figure, Alexander reinforced his right to rule over the vast territories he had conquered. His divine lineage justified his campaigns of conquest and allowed him to claim that his actions were part of a larger, divine plan. He was not just a king, he was an instrument of the gods, fulfilling a destiny that had been set in motion long before his birth. Yet, while Alexander himself embraced this divine status, it was the stories told after his death that would elevate him to an even higher level of myth. In the centuries following his passing, Alexander became the subject of countless legends and tales that depicted him as a hero of incredible strength and wisdom. These stories, sometimes exaggerated, portrayed him as a man who could do no wrong, one who overcame insurmountable odds, defeated mighty armies, and conquered lands that no other man had dared to tread. Perhaps the most famous of these myths was the story of the Gordian knot, a legendary puzzle that had baffled generations before Alexander. According to the myth, an ancient king of Phrygia had tied an intricate knot with a single, unbreakable rope, declaring that whoever could untie it would become the ruler of all Asia. Many had tried and failed to unravel the knot, but when Alexander arrived in Phrygia, he approached the puzzle with his characteristic boldness. Instead of attempting to untie it, he drew his sword and sliced through the knot in a single stroke. This act, both symbolically and literally, was seen as a demonstration of Alexander's destiny to rule over all of Asia, as if the gods themselves had cleared the way for his conquest. As we step away from the grand myths and tales surrounding Alexander, we pause to reflect on how these stories shaped not only his legacy, but also the way future generations viewed him. He became not just a historical figure, but a legend. A hero whose name would echo through the ages, inspiring those who sought to follow in his footsteps. His story, in the end, became more than just a recounting of battles and victories. It became a myth that transcended time. As the centuries wore on, the myth of Alexander grew ever larger, woven into the tapestry of history as much as his actual deeds. By the time of the Roman Empire, Alexander was no longer just a historical figure, but a symbol of ultimate conquest and divine favor, a hero who embodied the pinnacle of human achievement. The Romans, in particular, admired Alexander, seeing in him a kindred spirit, a conqueror who had unified the known world through his military genius and sheer force of will. Roman generals and emperors, including Julius Caesar and Augustus, looked to Alexander as an ideal model of leadership. Caesar even considered himself to be a successor to Alexander, and in his campaign to conquer Gaul and Britain, he often invoked Alexander's name to justify his own ambition and military campaigns. In fact, Alexander's mythic status helped inspire future leaders, not just in the Roman world, but across the medieval and Renaissance periods. The idea of a divine king, chosen by the gods and destined for greatness, became a model for rulers who sought to legitimize their power and conquer new lands. Alexander's legend provided a template for imperial expansion, showing how one could unify different peoples and cultures under a single banner. But it wasn't only military leaders who embraced the myth of Alexander. Philosophers, poets, and scholars also took up the task of immortalizing his life. The legend of Alexander became a central theme in literature, art, and philosophy. Writers such as Plutarch, in his famous Parallel Lives, explored Alexander's character, offering readers a complex and often contradictory portrait of the man. Alexander was portrayed as both a brilliant tactician and a man of immense ego, someone who, despite his divine mission, often struggled with the burden of his own ambition. The tales of Alexander's adventures and conquests also found their way into the works of poets and playwrights. From the Alexander Romance, a collection of stories written in Greek and later translated into many languages, to the works of medieval chroniclers, the myth of Alexander became intertwined with the stories of knights, heroes, and gods. In these retellings, Alexander often took on the qualities of a semi-divine figure, a man who could not be defeated and whose life was filled with miraculous feats. Even in the East, Alexander's mythic status remained prominent. In the Persian tradition, he was known as Iskander, and stories about his exploits became part of Persian epic literature. These tales portrayed Alexander not just as a conqueror, but as a wise and sometimes benevolent ruler who sought to bridge the gap between the Persian and Greek worlds. In these versions of the myth, Alexander was depicted as a hero who, despite his invasions, also sought wisdom and knowledge, often portrayed as a figure who respected the cultures he encountered rather than simply destroying them. Similarly, in the Islamic world, Alexander's legend became an integral part of the cultural fabric. Known as Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran, Alexander was portrayed as a righteous and just ruler who traveled the world, spreading knowledge and building bridges between civilizations. The Islamic interpretation of Alexander's story was often less focused on his military conquests and more on his wisdom and governance, with an emphasis on his role as a prophet-like figure who was chosen by God to lead and guide the people. The myth of Alexander had become something more than just the story of a king. It had become a narrative that transcended cultures, religions, and eras. It symbolized the ideal of a ruler who could conquer the world not just through force, but through intellect, divine favor, and the ability to unite people from all walks of life. Over time, Alexander became a figure whose name was spoken not only in the context of conquest, but in relation to the unity of mankind, to the potential for blending different cultures and ideas to create something greater than the sum of its parts. As we leave behind the stories of Alexander's mythic status, we reflect on how these myths have shaped the way we think about rulers, heroes, and the legacy of those who seek to leave their mark on the world. Alexander's story, though deeply intertwined with historical facts, evolved into a legend that continues to inspire and captivate to this day. The myth of Alexander the Great did not just live in the minds of poets, historians, and scholars. It also took root in the fabric of art and architecture, where his image continued to shape cultures long after his death. The magnificence of his conquests, his charisma, and his supposed divine favor were depicted in countless sculptures, coins, and murals, preserving his mythic status for generations to come. As the centuries passed, artists began to portray Alexander as an almost godlike figure, one whose strength and beauty reflected the heroic ideals of the ancient world. Roman artists, in particular, were fascinated by the image of Alexander and often used him as a model for the ideal ruler. Coins minted during the Roman Empire, bearing Alexander's likeness, were meant not only to symbolize the power of the emperor, but to invoke the prestige of Alexander himself. These coins often depicted Alexander with the horns of Ammon, a visual connection to the god Amun, reinforcing the idea of his divine parentage and godlike qualities. Alexander's image also appeared in statues that celebrated his martial prowess. The most famous of these is the equestrian statue of Alexander, which captured him in a dynamic and heroic pose. These statues, often larger than life, were meant to immortalize Alexander's military victories and his ability to inspire those who followed him. The grandiosity of his portrayal served as a reminder that Alexander was not just a historical figure, but a symbol of triumph, strength, and divine approval. In the Renaissance, centuries after Alexander's death, the myth of Alexander underwent a revival. Artists and scholars rediscovered the stories of his life and sought to capture the splendor of his conquests through paintings and sculptures. Alexander was often depicted as a charismatic, youthful hero, someone who embodied the virtues of courage, intelligence, and ambition. Renaissance thinkers, inspired by Alexander's legendary achievements, saw him as the ultimate model of the Renaissance man, a figure who could conquer not only through military might, but through intellectual and cultural achievements as well. These portrayals were not limited to the Western world. In India, where Alexander had briefly set foot during his campaigns, his image also took on mythic proportions. Local legends, passed down through generations, blended the historical figure with the mythological. Alexander was remembered not just as an invader, but as a figure who had encountered the ancient wisdom of the East, a bridge between the civilizations of Greece and India. His interactions with Indian philosophers and sages became part of the mythos surrounding him, transforming him into a larger-than-life figure who embodied both the warrior and the seeker of knowledge. Even in modern times, the myth of Alexander continues to resonate. In the 19th and 20th centuries, novelists, filmmakers, and playwrights revisited his story, weaving together the factual and the fantastical. Movies and books about Alexander depict him as a hero, sometimes larger than life, sometimes deeply human, but always filled with ambition and determination. His image is often used to symbolize the eternal struggle for greatness, to depict the ideal of a ruler who transcends the ordinary. In the 20th century, as empires rose and fell, Alexander's myth became a touchstone for modern leaders who sought to emulate his power and vision. Figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte admired Alexander and saw him as a model for their own imperial ambitions. Like Alexander, they sought to unite vast territories under their rule, inspired by his example of bold military strategy and unyielding ambition. As we move beyond the painted images and sculpted statues of Alexander, we see how his myth transcended the ages, evolving with the times, but always retaining the core qualities that made him legendary. His story, part historical, part mythological, remains a powerful symbol of leadership, vision, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. As we trace the path of Alexander's myth through history, it becomes clear that his legacy was not confined to the ancient world alone. The myth of Alexander continued to evolve and inspire even in the modern era, where his name became synonymous with greatness, ambition, and the pursuit of the impossible. His image, part conqueror, part deity, has been reinterpreted time and again as different societies found in him a figure to admire, emulate, or mythologize. In the modern age, the myth of Alexander gained new layers as historical and literary figures drew inspiration from his life. One of the most significant revivals of Alexander's myth came during the Age of Enlightenment, when thinkers and philosophers began to re-examine the ancient world. During this time, Alexander was often seen as a figure who bridged the gap between the classical ideals of Greece and the emerging modern world. Writers like Voltaire and others in the 18th century admired Alexander's intellectual curiosity as much as his military prowess. They looked at his education under Aristotle and his quest for knowledge as reflections of the Enlightenment ideals of reason, learning, and progress. In the realm of literature, Alexander's myth was transformed into a tale of not only conquest, but also personal transformation. Writers across Europe retold the story of Alexander in new ways, emphasizing different aspects of his character, his youth, his ambition, his brilliance, and his sometimes tragic flaws. As a result, the myth evolved beyond just a historical account and became a mirror for contemplating the nature of power, leadership, and destiny. The moral complexities of Alexander's character were explored in works that questioned the costs of greatness, the toll of ambition, and the price of empire building. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as European powers expanded across the globe, Alexander's myth once again found relevance. The imperial ambitions of figures like Napoleon Bonaparte echoed the legacy of Alexander's conquests. Napoleon, often referred to as the modern-day Alexander, was deeply inspired by the Macedonian king. He even carried a portrait of Alexander with him during his campaigns, and often compared his own military strategies to those of the great conqueror. Both men were driven by an insatiable desire to expand their empires, and both were determined to leave their mark on history. But Alexander's myth didn't just inspire imperialists. His legend also sparked a broader discussion about the nature of power and leadership. Writers and philosophers questioned whether Alexander's military genius and ambition were truly virtuous, or whether his quest for glory and domination had come at too high a cost. In the modern era, Alexander was seen as both a hero and a cautionary tale. A figure whose vision for empire was both awe-inspiring and fraught with moral ambiguity. The 20th century also saw the resurgence of interest in Alexander as a historical figure. Biographers and historians delved into the complexities of his life, seeking to separate fact from myth. Yet, even in the most objective histories, the mystique of Alexander remained intact. His ambition, his victories, his extraordinary journey, these were stories that captivated the modern imagination. Alexander was not simply a man of history, he had become a symbol of the eternal struggle to overcome limits and achieve greatness, no matter the personal cost. As we step back from the myth of Alexander, we can see that his story continues to serve as both a model and a warning. His legend has lived on for over 2 millennia, evolving and adapting to the times, reflecting the desires and fears of each new generation. Alexander's legacy, like the myths of ancient heroes, remains a powerful force, a tale of ambition, conquest, and the search for greatness that transcends time. The myth of Alexander the Great reached its fullest expression in the centuries that followed, taking on a life of its own in art, literature, and popular culture. As each era grappled with its own challenges, the myth of Alexander was reimagined, reshaped, and utilized in new ways. For many, he became more than just a historical figure. He became an enduring symbol of human potential and the quest for greatness. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Alexander's myth was embraced not only by military leaders and rulers, but also by the common people who looked to his story for inspiration. His life, filled with extraordinary feats and seemingly impossible conquests, became a narrative that encapsulated the spirit of adventure, the power of determination, and the glory of overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds. Alexander's image was no longer just that of a warrior king. He had transcended his historical role to become a universal symbol of ambition. Writers and thinkers across different disciplines began to look to him as a metaphor for human aspirations. The idea of one man taking on the world, uniting diverse cultures under a single vision, captured the imagination of a rapidly changing world. Alexander's myth, in many ways, embodied the belief that greatness could be achieved through willpower and vision, regardless of the challenges faced. In literature, the Alexander Romance, an epic collection of stories about his life, became one of the most widely read texts in both the East and the West. The romance, filled with fantastical elements and exaggerated tales of Alexander's divine favor and miraculous deeds, was translated into countless languages. These tales, often more myth than fact, made Alexander accessible to people across the globe. His exploits were told and retold in every culture that encountered the myth, from Europe to the Middle East to Asia. The image of Alexander was also cultivated in the world of art, especially during the Renaissance, when artists like Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci turned their attention to the heroic figure of the conqueror. In these works, Alexander was not just depicted as a military leader, but as a hero of classical ideals, embodying the virtues of bravery, wisdom, and divine right. Artists gave him an almost otherworldly presence, making him a timeless figure whose influence could not be confined to any one era. But the myth also began to take on more complex and even critical dimensions in modern times. As empires rose and fell, Alexander's story was used as a lens through which to examine the darker aspects of imperialism. Historians, particularly in the post-colonial era, began to look at Alexander's conquests through a more critical lens, examining not just his achievements but the cost of those achievements, the death and destruction left in his wake, the exploitation of conquered peoples, and the lack of a sustainable vision for governance began to complicate his legacy. For many modern readers and thinkers, Alexander's myth was no longer one of unqualified glory, but of cautionary reflection on the price of unchecked ambition. As the world became more interconnected through globalization, Alexander's myth continued to resonate across cultures. His story remained a universal symbol of leadership and conquest, but it also became a story about the fragility of empires. Modern leaders, from political figures to business magnates, still reference Alexander's legacy to inspire and legitimize their own pursuits. Yet, as the world shifted into the 21st century, the myth was understood less as an endorsement of empire building and more as a symbol of the complex relationship between power, ambition, and responsibility. As we step away from the myth of Alexander, we see how his legend continues to evolve, reflecting the changing values and perspectives of each new era. His story, timeless and ever-changing, remains an integral part of the human experience, a tale of greatness and downfall, of ambition and the cost of empire. The myth of Alexander is not just about one man's conquests. It is about the ideals and consequences that accompany the pursuit of power, the unity of cultures, and the dreams of those who seek to shape the world. As the centuries passed, the shadow of Alexander's empire loomed large over the ancient world. Though his vast empire fragmented in the wake of his death, his influence did not dissipate. The idea of empire building that he had popularized, the ambition to unite vast swathes of land under one ruler, persisted long after his time. The world would soon see the rise of new empires, each drawing inspiration, consciously or not, from the legacy of Alexander the Great. The first empire that would rise in the wake of Alexander's was the Roman Empire. While the Romans had already established themselves as a dominant force in the Mediterranean long before Alexander's conquests, it was his vision of uniting East and West under one banner that provided them with a model for expansion. The Romans admired Alexander not just for his military skill, but for his ability to integrate diverse cultures into a single empire. As the Romans conquered lands across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, they began to emulate Alexander's strategies, particularly his ability to incorporate local customs and traditions into their governance. The Romans, however, took Alexander's vision a step further. Whereas Alexander had sought to blend Greek and Eastern traditions, the Romans were more focused on establishing control over the territories they conquered, ensuring that their laws, governance, and infrastructure took precedence. Rome's empire building was built on the foundation of Roman law, military discipline, and infrastructure, and it would go on to become one of the most influential and enduring empires in history. Still, the inspiration drawn from Alexander's success was clear. Roman leaders, from Julius Caesar to Augustus, looked to Alexander as a model of power, conquest, and unification. Alexander's legacy also lived on in the empires that followed, particularly in the rise of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire. The Byzantines, who ruled over much of the eastern Mediterranean, continued to hold Alexander in high regard, and they too saw themselves as the inheritors of his vision. They celebrated the blending of cultures, much like Alexander had, and sought to preserve and expand the intellectual, cultural, and religious unity of the Mediterranean world. For the Byzantine emperors, Alexander was not just a fig. You're from the past. He was a model of imperial ambition and cultural assimilation, a ruler whose empire, though brief, had laid the groundwork for centuries of influence. To the east, the influence of Alexander's empire was also felt in the rise of the Maurya Empire in India. When Alexander's forces invaded the northwest region of India, they encountered powerful kingdoms that would ultimately resist their advance. However, Alexander's brief stay in India sparked a chain reaction. The local ruler, King Porus, was defeated in battle, but Alexander's campaign was short-lived. His departure, however, opened the door for a new force in the region, the Maurya Empire. Under Chandragupta Maurya, the Mauryas united much of the Indian subcontinent into a single empire, establishing a centralized bureaucracy and developing trade routes that spanned across Asia. The Mauryas were not directly inspired by Alexander's example, but the political landscape of the region had been irrevocably changed by his campaigns. Alexander's brief foray into India helped to unify the region, and his influence can be seen in the later development of the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that would connect the East with the West for centuries. This exchange of goods, ideas, and culture was a legacy of Alexander's far-reaching conquests, and it would continue to shape the development of civilizations across Asia and Europe. As we reflect on the rise of these empires in the wake of Alexander's death, we can see how his vision of unification and conquest resonated throughout history. The idea of building vast, multicultural empires, blending different cultures under one ruler, became a central theme for empires in both the East and West. Alexander's mythic legacy, in part, provided the blueprint for future leaders and conquerors who sought to follow in his footsteps. As the legacy of Alexander's ambition continued to inspire future empires, the world saw new centers of power emerge, each shaped in part by the ideals and lessons learned from the Macedonian king. The rise of the Roman Empire, with its vast territorial expansion and sophisticated governance, was perhaps the most significant in terms of both military and cultural influence. Rome's eventual dominance in the West would set the stage for a world order that would persist for centuries, but Alexander's imprint could still be felt in more subtle ways. The Roman Empire, particularly under the reign of Augustus, began to see themselves as the heirs to Alexander's legacy. Augustus and his successors followed in the Macedonian king's footsteps by extending the empire into new territories and seeking to unify different cultures under the Roman banner. Like Alexander, Augustus faced the challenge of maintaining control over a diverse and sprawling empire, and like his predecessor, he employed policies that sought to blend local customs and traditions with Roman rule. Roman citizens were granted a sense of shared identity, but local rulers and cultures were also incorporated into the larger Roman framework, just as Alexander had integrated Persian, Egyptian, and Greek traditions into his own empire. The Roman Empire, however, differed from Alexander's empire in that it was far more organized and enduring. Rome, with its complex system of laws and governance, laid the foundation for a political order that would last for centuries, even as the geographical extent of its power ebbed and flowed. While Alexander's empire fragmented upon his death, the Roman Empire had the infrastructure and political systems in place to continue, eventually becoming one of the longest-lasting empires in history. Yet, the same ambition and drive that Alexander had exemplified in his own time, his desire for conquest, expansion, and control, was still present in the heart of Roman imperialism. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, maintained much of the cultural and philosophical legacy of Alexander. Byzantine rulers, particularly those in the early centuries, drew heavily from Hellenistic traditions, and Alexander was often invoked as a symbol of imperial authority. The Byzantines considered themselves the inheritors of the Greek and Roman traditions, blending Greek culture with the Christian faith. This unique fusion of influences mirrored Alexander's own approach to governance, as he had sought to integrate Greek and Eastern cultures into his rule. However, the Byzantines also faced challenges of their own, as the empire struggled to maintain its grip on territories in the face of external pressures. They often looked to Alexander's example for guidance on how to hold their empire together. Byzantine emperors viewed themselves not only as political leaders, but as spiritual and intellectual heirs to the legacy of Alexander, often invoking his name in diplomacy and warfare. The idea of an emperor who could unite diverse peoples under one rule was central to the Byzantine vision of governance, just as it had been for Alexander centuries earlier. Across the world in India, the influence of Alexander's brief campaign continued to be felt, albeit in a more indirect way. While Alexander's forces had only made a brief foray into the subcontinent, his campaigns had sparked a series of political changes that reverberated through the region. The Maurya Empire, founded by Chandragupta Maurya, arose in part due to the power vacuum left by Alexander's withdrawal. The Mauryas were not the direct successors of Alexander, but the brief encounter with Macedonian forces helped to solidify their control over much of the Indian subcontinent. The Mauryas themselves would go on to create a powerful empire that united much of India under one rule, borrowing some of the organizational strategies and military techniques of their Greek predecessors. In the centuries that followed, the influence of Alexander's empire also helped to shape the Silk Road, a network of trade routes connecting the East and West. While Alexander had never directly established the Silk Road, his conquests and the subsequent expansion of trade between the Mediterranean, Persia, and Central Asia contributed to the growth of this vital trade network. Merchants and travelers from Greece, India, China, and beyond exchanged goods, ideas, and technologies, and the cultural fusion that Alexander had initiated continued to thrive along these trade routes. As we look at the rise of empires that followed Alexander's death, it is clear that his vision of unity, conquest, and the blending of cultures set the stage for future empires to follow. From Rome to Byzantium and beyond, Alexander's story was one of ambition that stretched across continents, and even after his empire fell apart, his legacy of cultural fusion and imperialism persisted throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. As empires rose and fell in the centuries following Alexander's death, his legacy of cultural exchange and empire building continued to influence the course of history. The idea of unifying vast territories under a single ruler became a defining goal for leaders across the ancient world. Alexander's ambition, though short-lived in terms of political unity, laid the groundwork for future empires to build upon his vision of a vast, interconnected world. One of the most enduring legacies of Alexander's empire was his role in spreading Hellenistic culture across 3 continents. This cultural diffusion went far beyond mere military conquest. It involved the blending of philosophies, religions, art, and technologies from the Mediterranean, Asia, and Africa. As his soldiers marched eastward, they brought Greek customs and ideas with them, leaving behind a rich cultural legacy that would continue to shape the world for centuries. The cities Alexander founded, especially those in Egypt, Central Asia, and the Near East, became focal points of Hellenistic culture. Alexandria, in particular, stood as the jewel of the Hellenistic world. It was here that Greek and Egyptian cultures fused, where the great library of Alexandria became the center of knowledge and learning, and where scholars from around the world gathered to exchange ideas. It was in Alexandria that many great scientific advancements were made, from the study of astronomy to mathematics, and it became a place where both Greek and local philosophies were respected and integrated. As the Roman Empire expanded, it inherited much of the intellectual and cultural traditions of the Greeks, which had been spread by Alexander's conquests. Roman leaders and generals were heavily influenced by the legacy of Alexander, particularly in terms of military strategy and governance. The Romans, like Alexander, embraced the concept of an empire that could unite diverse peoples under a single banner. And just as Alexander had done, the Romans sought to blend local customs with their own, creating a system of governance that respected local traditions while ensuring Roman supremacy. In the east, Alexander's conquests paved the way for the rise of the Kushan Empire, which controlled much of Central Asia and parts of northern India. The Kushans were heavily influenced by Hellenistic art and culture, incorporating Greek elements into their own artistic traditions. This cultural exchange was particularly evident in their coinage, which often depicted Greek gods and motifs, and in the development of the Greco-Buddhist art style, which emerged as a result of the fusion of Greek and Indian artistic traditions. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road was also influenced by the same cultural exchanges that Alexander had set in motion. The Silk Road itself, which emerged as a key trade network between the East and West, can be seen as one of the most direct results of Alexander's military campaigns. The Silk Road itself, which emerged as a key trade network between the East and West, can be seen as one of the most direct results of Alexander's military campaigns. While he did not create the Silk Road, his conquests played a pivotal role in linking the Mediterranean world with Central Asia and China. The roads Alexander's armies traveled opened up new pathways for trade and communication, allowing goods, ideas, and technologies to flow between cultures. The exchange of silk, spices, and other goods helped create a vibrant global economy that would continue to thrive for centuries. The intellectual legacy of Alexander also left a profound impact on the field of science. Greek thinkers who traveled with Alexander, such as the philosopher Aristotle and the mathematician Euclid, helped to spread Greek scientific knowledge throughout the regions Alexander conquered. This knowledge laid the foundation for future scientific developments, particularly during the Roman and Islamic Golden Ages. Alexander's role in the transmission of scientific ideas between East and West, whether through the creation of institutions like the Library of Alexandria or through the travels of scholars along the Silk Road, cannot be overstated. As we leave the world of rising empires and the spread of Alexander's influence, we see how his vision, though fleeting, helped to create an interconnected world where the blending of cultures, ideas, and philosophies continued to shape the course of history. The ambition to unite vast territories and diverse peoples under one ruler, to blend traditions and create something greater than the sum of its parts, became a blueprint for empires that followed. As Alexander's legacy continued to ripple through the centuries, it wasn't just through empires or cities that his influence endured. His name became a byword for greatness, and his story an endless well of inspiration and cautionary tale. Throughout history, Alexander's life and conquests were studied not only for their military brilliance but also for the larger-than-life persona he left behind, one that could be imitated, learned from, and occasionally avoided. In the early Middle Ages, long after the fall of Rome and the disintegration of Alexander's empire, his myth still resonated. Kings and rulers, from Charlemagne in the west to various Islamic caliphs in the east, took Alexander as a model for their own power and ambitions. His image was not that of a king, but of a conqueror whose influence spread far beyond the borders of his empire. Rulers saw in him the possibility of building a realm that transcended local boundaries, a world that could be shaped by one individual's vision. During the Islamic Golden Age, Alexander was revered as a wise and virtuous ruler in much of the Arab world. Known as Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran, Alexander was often depicted as a just and noble figure who traveled the world spreading knowledge and wisdom. His image here was less about military conquest and more about governance, moral righteousness, and the pursuit of truth. Islamic scholars, influenced by Alexander's desire for learning, translated Greek texts and integrated much of the knowledge from the ancient world into Islamic thought. For these scholars, Alexander became a symbol not of empire building, but of the potential for a ruler to be both a seeker of knowledge and a bearer of justice. Throughout medieval Europe, Alexander's myth continued to evolve in the form of the Alexander Romance, a collection of legendary tales that portrayed him as a hero beyond the mortal realm. These stories depicted Alexander as a paragon of virtue, intelligence, and bravery, a hero who, though human, was touched by the divine. The Alexander Romance became widely circulated, from the Byzantine Empire to the courts of medieval Europe, and influenced countless later stories of knights, warriors, and kings. Alexander's ability to inspire awe, wonder, and a sense of moral superiority made him an ideal figure for medieval rulers to emulate. In the Renaissance, as Europe experienced a revival of interest in the classical world, Alexander's figure was once again brought into the limelight. Artists, poets, and scholars looked to Alexander not only as a conqueror, but as an embodiment of Renaissance ideals, the perfect balance of intellect, physical prowess, and ambition. His stories of military genius and philosophical depth were embraced by Renaissance thinkers who saw in him a role model for rulers who sought to blend art, knowledge, and power. Alexander became an exemplar of the Renaissance man, someone who could master every aspect of life and leave a legacy that shaped the world. Alexander's influence was not limited to the classical world, nor did it fade after the Renaissance. His myth continued to inspire the great imperialists of the modern era. Napoleon Bonaparte, perhaps the most famous of these, openly admired Alexander and sought to emulate him as he built his own empire. Napoleon saw in Alexander a conqueror who not only reshaped the world through force, but through vision, courage, and the will to leave a mark on history. His admiration for Alexander even extended to carrying a portrait of the Macedonian king into battle, suggesting that the pursuit of glory, military success, and empire building was an eternal ambition shared by both men. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Alexander's myth also began to intersect with a growing sense of nationalism and imperialism. As European powers expanded across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, Alexander's example was often invoked to justify the idea of empire and the spread of civilization. The imperialists who followed in Alexander's footsteps often saw themselves as carrying the torch of his vision, expanding borders, spreading culture, and imposing their will on the world. Alexander, in this context, was no longer just a symbol of military genius, but of colonial domination, a figure whose conquests justified the expansionist ambitions of later rulers. As we move forward in history, we see how Alexander's myth has evolved alongside the empires and ideologies that have followed. From the early days of the Roman Empire to the modern age of imperialism, Alexander has been a symbol of ambition, power, and the eternal desire to shape the world. His story, at once historical and mythical, continues to serve as a reminder of the complexities of leadership, the consequences of empire building, and the enduring legacy of one of the world's most legendary figures. As we reach the close of our exploration of Alexander's enduring legacy, it is evident that his influence continues to resonate throughout history, albeit in ways that no one could have predicted during his brief, meteoric life. The empires that rose in his wake were shaped by the idea that one man, through willpower, ambition, and vision, could transform the world. From the Romans to the Byzantines, from the early Islamic caliphs to the European empires of the modern age, Alexander's example has lived on, shaping the ways we think about leadership, governance, and the very notion of empire itself. But Alexander's myth has not been without its contradictions. While he is remembered as a brilliant conqueror and visionary, his legacy is also a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. His empire, though vast and impressive, was short-lived. The dream of a unified world under one ruler, so ardently pursued by Alexander, was not to be realized. And yet, his myth lives on precisely because it encapsulates the tension between greatness and fragility, between vision and the limitations of power. In some ways, Alexander's story is timeless because it reflects the human drive for transcendence. His ambition to conquer the world and his desire to unite diverse peoples were born out of an idealistic vision of how humanity could work together. He sought to blend cultures, to mix the East with the West, to create an empire where knowledge and ideas flowed freely. This vision, however, was marred by the violence of conquest, the suffering of the people he subdued, and the sheer exhaustion of an empire built too quickly, too expansively. Nevertheless, Alexander's mythic status has continued to evolve, especially in the modern era. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as global powers like Britain, France, and later the United States began to build their own empires, they saw Alexander's example as one to be followed. Like Alexander, they viewed imperial expansion as a way to assert their dominance and spread their civilization across the globe. And yet, the lessons from Alexander's empire, the dangers of overreach, the fleeting nature of power, remained ever present. Even in today's world, Alexander's legacy lingers in the way we view leadership, empire, and conquest. His ambition, his desire to push boundaries, and his ability to inspire have made him a symbol for those who seek to lead, whether in politics, business, or even personal life. The idea that one person can change the course of history through sheer willpower continues to inspire leaders to this day. But Alexander also serves as a cautionary tale. The empire that once spanned continents was eventually fractured and divided, and the world he sought to unify was ultimately left with a legacy of conflict, both among his successors and in the centuries that followed. Yet, perhaps the most lasting part of Alexander's legacy lies in the way he reshaped the world culturally and intellectually. His conquests set the scene, age for a cultural exchange between East and West that would change the world forever. The melding of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian ideas led to a flourishing of knowledge, art, and philosophy that helped shape the foundations of modern Western thought. His campaigns sparked the spread of Hellenistic culture, which, through the Romans and later the spread of Christianity and Islam, influenced civilizations for centuries. Alexander's impact also stretches into the realm of exploration and the pursuit of knowledge. His desire to push beyond the known world encouraged later generations of explorers and thinkers. His campaigns laid the groundwork for the Silk Road, opening trade routes that connected the East and West and allowed for the exchange of not just goods but ideas, technologies, and innovations that continue to shape our world today. In the end, Alexander's story is both one of triumph and tragedy, of greatness and imperfection. His ambition reshaped the world in ways that are still felt today, yet his empire was short-lived, and his dream of a unified world under one ruler was never fully realized. Nonetheless, his myth endures, a testament to the lasting power of vision, leadership, and the timeless human drive to change the world. His legacy, in its many forms, continues to inspire those who seek greatness, whether in the halls of power or in the quiet pursuit of knowledge and wisdom. As we reflect on Alexander the Great's incredible journey, we see that his story is one that transcends time, filled with ambition, triumph, and the eternal pursuit of greatness. His legacy, woven into the fabric of history, continues to echo through empires, cultures, and ideas, inspiring those who seek to leave their own mark on the world. Though his empire fell, the impact of his vision and leadership remains woven into the world's history, shaping civilizations, philosophies, and even our understanding of what it means to dream big. Alexander's name has lived on not just as a conqueror, but as a symbol of the boundless human ambition to reach beyond the horizon. As you drift into rest, may the echoes of his story guide you through your own dreams of discovery, greatness, and legacy, just as it has for centuries. If tonight's story has helped you find a bit of peace, let me know below. Sweet dreams. Until next time, my friends, may the quiet moments of reflection and ambition stay with you, wherever you may journey.